Hello and welcome to the webinar. We'll begin shortly. Before we do begin, a quick note to please take a moment to review the slide that's on the screen right now. Unfortunately, for a portion of the webinar, if you have used the audio on a dial-in bridge, you will not be able to hear the recorded portion of the webinar. The solution to this is if you're on a mobile device, you can download the GoToWebinar app and hear the webinar in that fashion. But if you did dial in, unfortunately, you will not be able to hear the first part of the webinar. If this is your only option, please know that we will have this presentation along with the transcript and the materials will be available on the Broadband USA website by August 11th. So you'll have an opportunity to see that then. Thank you, and we'll begin shortly.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Broadband Infrastructure Program webinar for this August. This will be the last webinar before the applications are due on August 17th. My name is Susanna Spellman, and I'm with NTIA's Broadband USA program. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to NTIA's Broadband USA program website. Today's webinar focuses on NTIA's Broadband Infrastructure Program and is the fifth of a many-part series. Before we begin, I would like to review the logistics for today's webinar. First, we will open up the webinar for questions after the completion of presentations. As you hear from each presenter, please use the question box on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions or comments. Second, the presentation along with the transcript and audio recording of today's session will be available on the Broadband USA website within 7 days of this webinar under the Events/Past Events tab. Finally, please visit our Broadband USA website for information about our technical assistance program, including useful guides, products, publications, and other tools that can assist you with planning, funding, and implementing your broadband project. We provide updated information, including our monthly newsletter and other broadband news. Our presenters today are Jennifer Duane, the Director of Grants for NTIA, Natalie Romanoff, a Grants Management Specialist within NTIA, and Catherine Bates, the team lead for the Broadband Infrastructure Program within NTIA. Our first speaker is Jennifer Duane. Jennifer is a Senior Broadband Program Specialist for NTIA's Broadband USA program, where she manages the office's grant programs and facilitates interagency coordination to support efforts to streamline federal permitting processes. Jennifer joined NTIA in 2009 to develop policy for the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, otherwise known as BTOP. She then served for 2 years as a senior attorney advisor at the Office of Chief Counsel for NTIA, providing legal advice to NTIA offices on a variety of telecommunications, information technology, and commercial data privacy matters. From 2012 to 2017, she served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary on matters related to broadband and public safety. Before joining NTIA, Jennifer served as a state regulatory attorney and then director of federal regulatory affairs for Sprint Corporation. She earned an undergraduate degree in economics from Penn State and a Juris Doctor degree from the George Washington University Law School. Our next speaker, Natalie Romanoff, is a member of NTIA's Office of Public Safety Communications, serving as the program director for the SLIGP 2.0 grant program, and is on a detail to OTIA to support the new broadband grant programs. Natalie has more than 15 years of experience in grant and program management and has a Master of Public Administration degree from George Mason University. Our last speaker is Catherine Bates. She is back with us after being on loan to the Treasury Department earlier this summer and spring, rejoining us as the team lead on the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Additionally, Catherine has worked with state and local governments to increase broadband access throughout the United States, focusing on unserved and underserved areas. Before coming to NTIA and the Broadband USA program, she worked with large library systems on the E-rate modernization effort at ICF International, a global consulting firm, where she focused on broadband funding, planning, training, and technical assistance. Prior to that work, she worked for a decade at a national association representing municipal interests, focusing her efforts on information technology, broadband policy, and community and economic development. Catherine received her bachelor's in business and master's of public administration from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So real quickly, our agenda today is to go over the high-level programmatic aspects of the Broadband Infrastructure Program. That will be led by Jennifer. And then Natalie Romanoff will go through the application, including the pre-submission activities, how to complete the forms, how to submit, et cetera. And then Catherine will go through some of the FAQs that we've been getting over the last couple of months, and also provide information on where you can find links to new FAQs. And we'll again discuss some of the top FAQs that we've been getting. After that, we will open up for Q&A and taking questions from you that you provide in the chat during the presentation and in Q&A session. And now we turn the presentation over to Jennifer Duane.
Thanks, Susanna. I'm Jennifer Duane, Director of Grants for NTIA. And as I've done in the June and July webinars that we had on this program, I'm going to spend a few moments in this webinar highlighting some of the key definitions and requirements for the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Now, the Broadband Infrastructure Program is a grant program where NTIA has $288 million available to award to covered partnerships, and those are defined as a partnership between a state and one or more political subdivisions of a state and a fixed broadband service provider. Now, the covered partnerships are required to deploy covered broadband projects, and these are projects that are competitively and technologically neutral to deploy fixed broadband service that provides qualifying broadband service in an eligible service area. NTIA opened up the application window for this program on May 19th, 2021, with the release of its Notice of Funding Opportunity. The statute required us to give a 90-day application period to accept applications. So we will be accepting applications for this program through August 17th, 2021. Now, I just want to highlight a couple of key points and definitions for the program. The first is qualifying broadband service, and that is defined in the Act as the provision of broadband service that provides speeds of 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload, and latency that supports real-time interactive applications. In the NOFO, NTIA also added a few more clarifications to that definition. We indicated that the speed requirement of 25.3 means the ability to provide 25.3 simultaneously to every household in the eligible service area. And we defined latency to mean 95% or more of all peak period measurements of network round trip latency are at or below 100 milliseconds. The other definition that I want to emphasize is the definition of unserved. Now, unserved under the Act means a household lacks access to qualifying broadband service, which I just discussed, and no broadband provider has been selected to receive or is otherwise receiving federal or state funding subject to enforceable build-out commitments to deploy qualifying broadband service in the specific area where the household is located by date certain, even if such service is not yet available, provided that the federal or state agency providing the funding has not deemed the service provider to be in default of its build-out obligations under the applicable federal or state program. The next key point I want to emphasize on this slide goes to eligibility. Now, an eligible service area is defined under the Act as a census block in which broadband service is not available at one or more households or businesses in the census block. Now, to determine that eligibility, we'll be looking at the information that the FCC has provided in its maps, the FCC Form 4777 data. And we'll also leverage NTIA's National Broadband Availability Map in determining what qualifies as an eligible service area, along with other data sources that we have in the map or that we have available to us. The eligibility also gets to the eligibility for this program, and that to be eligible to submit an application under this program, we need to understand who the covered partnership is, what the covered broadband project will be, and that includes the speeds at which the project will be, or at which broadband service will be offered, along with the cost of the project. That also means identifying the proposed service area for funding. And then there's also the requirement in the Act that the applicant, the covered partnership, identify any state or federal support that the fixed broadband service provider that is part of the covered partnership is receiving for the proposed service area that's identified in the application. Now, the NOFO also includes a lot of other requirements that are required to submit with your application. So I'll just, rather than go through them as part of this webinar, I'll just refer you to look at the NOFO for all the key requirements that of an application that has to be submitted for this program. And then the last point on this slide is the prioritization factors. Now, the Act identified several priorities or funding priorities, and NTIA is prioritizing the first funding priority that was identified in the Act, and that is to provide qualifying broadband service to the greatest number of households in a eligible service area. And we're going to be sequencing applications as they come in to identify those that are focused on this initial funding priority when we review applications for funding. The other priorities are focused on providing broadband service to areas that are more rural in nature. So the Act talks about looking at areas that include areas other than those that have 50,000 inhabitants. And that is just a prioritization factor. It's not an eligibility factor. So applicants that have areas that are including counties or other areas that do have 50,000, more than 50,000 inhabitants are still eligible to apply. It's just they are not covered by this funding priority that's been identified in the Act. And then there's also the requirement that we look at projects that are the most effective, cost effective, and prioritizing those that are in rural areas. And then the final prioritization factor is the speed level. And we'll be looking at applications that propose broadband service providing speeds of 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about eligible uses of funds. Now, grant funds may only be used to pay for allowable costs. And those are defined as costs that are reasonable, necessary, and appropriate, and allocable to the project. Costs may be direct or indirect. So direct costs are those that are directly traceable to the project. Indirect costs are more akin to overhead. An applicant that wants to include indirect costs in its project proposal must provide that as part of its budget. And they must have a DOC approved indirect cost rate or be applying for one, or just use the de minimis indirect cost of 10%. And this is all detailed in the NOFO sections on the application submission requirements. Now, the Act identified several eligible uses of funds, and and these are also set forth in more detail in the NOFO. So the covered partnership may use grant funds to fund the cost of construction, improvement, and/or the acquisition of facilities and equipment required to provide qualifying broadband service. And this includes infrastructure for backhaul, middle, and last mile networks. And we tried to craft these eligible use categories fairly broadly to make sure that they can encompass as many activities that are necessary to deploy broadband infrastructure as possible. Another allowable cost is the cost of long-term leases. And these are for facilities that are required to provide qualifying broadband service. And this includes indivisible right of use IRU agreements. So we say the costs are that the terms can be greater than 1 year, but basically the applicant needs to provide payment for the cost of the lease during the award period of performance, which is 1 year, or unless or longer if you receive an extension by the Assistant Secretary. Also, cost of engineering design, permitting, and work related to the environmental and historical and cultural review process are allowable. In our July webinar, we went into more detail on the requirements associated with the environmental and historical and cultural reviews. So I would refer you back to those for some more detail on that, on what would be covered under environmental and historical and cultural reviews. Also, personnel costs, including salaries and fringe benefits for staff that are working on the project. These are all allowable costs. And so folks that are working as project managers, program directors, grant administrators, financial analysts that are working directly on the project may be paid for with grant funds under the program. We also allow for reasonable pre-application expenses or grant preparation and costs, but they may not exceed $50,000. And then there's, of course, the catch-all of allowable costs, which are necessary to carrying out the program activities of an award, but they do not include ineligible costs. So just as we have eligible costs, we also have ineligible costs. And there are two categories, one that applies to all members of the covered partnership, and one that applies to just the broadband, the fixed broadband service providers that are part of the covered partnership. So for with respect to the covered partnership, they may not use grant funds received under the program to purchase or support any covered communications equipment or services as defined in Section 9 of the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019. So basically, they may not procure equipment that may pose national security risk. Also, profits or fees and other incremental charges above actual costs are not allowable under the program. And then the covered partnership may not use grant funds directly or indirectly to support or oppose collective bargaining. Now, with respect to the provider of broadband service that is part of the covered partnership, they may not use funds to repay or make any other payment related to a loan that's made by any public or private lender. They also may not use funds as collateral for a loan made by any public or private lender. And they may not use more than $50,000 of the grant amounts to pay for the preparation of the grant. Also, they may not use funds for previously incurred administrative costs or previously purchased equipment or construction activities undertaken prior to the award. And then finally, costs may not be used to locate any funding from that the provider has received to deploy broadband service at locations that are used to meet an FCC Universal Service Fund deployment obligation. So as I mentioned before, we are accepting applications for this program. They must be by Grants.gov, and they must be received no later than 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 17th, 2021. So now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Natalie Romanoff, and she's going to go into a deeper dive on the application package that is required under the program, and looking at each of the standard forms that are required, and along with the budget narrative and detailed budget justification. She'll go into a bit more detail on that. And so the slides that I covered on eligible uses and ineligible uses will factor into that discussion, because when you're completing your budgets, you need to make sure that they only contain costs that are eligible for funding under the program. So with that, I will turn this over to Natalie for her presentation on the application review materials. Over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Jennifer. Today, I'm going to walk through several aspects of the Broadband Infrastructure Program application. While there are many steps in the federal grant process, today I'm going to focus on completing pre-application activities and submitting the application in Grants.gov. While you're gathering your application materials, it is extremely important your organization has an active SAM.gov registration. If your SAM.gov registration is inactive, it may take up to 30 days to reactivate your account. You must have an active SAM.gov registration to receive federal funding. In addition to SAM.gov, you need to make sure you have access to Workspace and Grants.gov for your entity. This will mean you need to have a username and a password. It could take several days to rectify Grants.gov access issues, so be sure to check and make sure you have access to the system for your organization as soon as possible in case you need to make any changes. Lastly, to ensure you have a complete application, use the Content and Form of Application section in the NOFO to verify your application is complete before you submit it. Incomplete applications will not be accepted. This slide is pulled directly from page 26 of the NOFO and provides details on how to register in Grants.gov. The biggest takeaway is that the state or political subdivision will need to have their active SAM.gov registration and a DUNS number in order to register and apply in Grants.gov. The Broadband Infrastructure Program will be using all of the standard form SF424 family for the application. All of the standard forms will be found on Grants.gov. The standard forms that you will be required to complete are the SF424, SF424C, SF424D, and applicable lobbying forms. In addition to the standard forms, the Broadband Infrastructure Program requires specific programmatic and budgetary information as part of the application package, as seen in the right column. These forms will be created by you and are not standard or pre-created forms. The documents include a project narrative, a budget narrative, and detailed budget justification, an indirect cost rate, if you're using one, letters of commitment, maps of the proposed service areas, pro forma financial information and analysis, and network diagrams and system diagrams. Now I will do an overview of some of the application documents. For the next several slides, I will walk you through the SF424, which is required with your application. Not all of the highlighted sections are required, and some of the non-highlighted sections are highly encouraged to be completed, so I will walk you through what sections to complete. In sections 1 and 2, you will indicate that your submission is an application and new. Section 3 will auto-populate when you submit your application in Grants.gov, so you do not need to complete that field. You are also not required to complete fields 4, 5A, 5B, 6, or 7. The next section you will need to complete is section 8, which is the applicant information. The legal name you enter into the SF424 must match your SAM.gov registration. Similarly, the EIN, organizational DUNS, and the address must also be associated with the legal name listed in your SAM.gov registration. Section E is not required, but is recommended. It is recommended that the applicant complete the department name and/or the division name for the entity applying for the federal funds, especially if the applicant is the state. The next section that is required is section F, which is the name and contact information of the person involved in the application. Typically, this is the authorized representative. You will need to enter their name, title, phone number, and email address. The organizational affiliation field is optional, but recommended. In section 9, you will need to enter your eligibility status as your type of applicant. More information on eligible entities can be found in the NOFO on page 9. In section 10, you will complete the name of the federal agency as the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. You do not need to complete section 11, which is the CFDA number. In section 12, you'll complete the funding opportunity number information as the Broadband Infrastructure Program. This is found on the first page of the NOFO and in Grants.gov. Section 13 is not required to be completed. Section 14 is not required, but is highly recommended to be completed if you will have multiple areas affected by the project. You can add a Word document or an Excel sheet if you have more than one area affected by the project. Section 15, you will enter a descriptive title for your project. Section 16 is required to be completed. you will enter the congressional districts for where your project will be located in sections A and B. You can attach a spreadsheet or a Word document if more congressional districts will be impacted by the project. If you do not know your congressional districts, please go to www.house.gov to search to find your congressional districts. The proposed start and end date should be listed as a one-year period of performance starting after November 29th, 2021. Please be aware that only your official award document from NTIA will determine your period of performance. This that you enter will not be your period of performance. Section 18 is the funding section. In row A, you will enter the total federal amount that you are requesting. If you are providing a match, enter the match amount in the correct field, either B, C, D, or E, depending on where the funding will be coming from. Question 19 is required. This program is subject to Executive Order 12372. If your state has a designated intergovernmental review SPOC or SPOC, please indicate field A and complete when you sent your application over to that person for review. If your state does not have a designated intergovernmental review SPOC, you can select B and submit your application without state review. Please visit whitehouse.gov's Federal Financial Management page to see a list of the current state intergovernmental review SPOCs. Question 20 is required. If your entity is delinquent on any federal debt, you need to check yes and provide an attachment explaining the debt. Question 21 is also required. The list of certifications and assurances can be found in the SF-424D. The last section, the authorized representative information, must also be completed. You need to fill in the name, first name, last name, title, telephone number, and email address. The authorized representative must also sign and date the form. In addition to the SF-424, you must also submit the standard forms SF-424C and SF-424D. The next several slides, I will talk about the SF-424C. The SF-424C is one of 3 project budget documents you will need to submit with your application. You will submit this form along with a budget narrative and a budget detailed justification. The SF-424C is found on Grants.gov. The budget narrative and detailed justification are not standard forms, so you will need to create these documents to submit with your application. In the SF-424C, you will complete columns A, total costs, B, costs not allowable for participation, and column C, total allowable costs. Column A is where you will input the total cost for your project by cost classification. This will include your federal funding requests, any match you will provide, and any other funds needed to complete your project. Column B is where you will input the amount of funding that is not allowable, but you are using to support this project. This could be other sources of federal funding, such as a federal grant or funding for activities that are not allowable under this program, but you plan on completing with outside funds. Column C is the total allowable cost for each cost classification, which is column A minus column B. When you submit your application, your budget narrative and budget detailed justification should mirror the SF-424C budget document. The budget narrative is typically a Word document where you give detail to each type of charge for your project. Typically, this detail includes a description of the activity or fee, the cost basis, the cost unit, the number of units, and the total cost. The budget detail justification is typically an Excel document showing the type of cost, quantity, unit cost, and total for each line item. If you will be providing match for the project, you will need to indicate this match on both the budget narrative and budget detail justification and clearly delineate what will be matching costs and what will be federally funded costs. I will quickly go through the cost classifications on the SF-424C. Row 1 is for your administrative and legal expenses. Unlike the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, the Broadband Infrastructure Program does not have a cap or a maximum percentage of total charges for this cost classification. Some examples of administrative expenses include costs attributable to accounting, auditing, budgeting, and general ledger services, or facility occupancy costs like rent or utilities. Typically, your indirect costs will fall into this category. Row 2 is for charges for land, structures, right-of-way, appraisals, and other similar charges. This may include structures like a utility hut or a rights-of-way permit needed for construction activities. Row 3 is for relocation expenses and payments. This could include charges related to moving equipment from one building to another. Row 4 is for architectural and engineering fees. These fees could be for plans or designs to be developed. If you're not sure if the fee is specifically for architectural or engineering activities, you can list the other fees in row 5, which is other architectural and engineering fees. These fees could include testing fees for the network or equipment, or field study fees. Row 6 is for any project inspection fees or fees directly related to project inspection. Any administrative or filing fees should be included in your administrative and legal expenses section, which is row 1. Row 7 is for site work costs. This could include costs for the site work, site preparation, or site utility work necessary for your project. Row 8 is for demolition and removal fees. Any environmental fees associated with the demolition should be included in the administrative and legal section, which is row 1. Row 9 is for construction costs. You should input all costs for the construction activities for your project, which will include taxes and any delivery fees. Row 10 is for equipment costs. These should be any costs for equipment for the project, but not for equipment components for the network that are associated with construction activities. If you have small office machinery, you can also put those costs in this row. Row 11 is for miscellaneous charges. If you have a charge that does not fit into any of the previous cost classifications, you can put it in this row. Be sure to give a detailed description of the cost so NTIA understands what you are planning on charging to the award. Row 13 is for contingencies. Contingency fees are not reimbursable by federal funds. Row 15 is for project or program income. If you believe you will have program income as defined by 2 CFR 200.307, you can enter the estimated amount here. Please remember that only program income during the period of performance should be indicated on this row. Row 16, column C, will be the total allowable cost for your project, which is inclusive of the federal charges and match contribution. Then in row 17, you will enter the percentage of the federal share for your project. If you're not providing a match, your project will be 100% federally funded, and therefore you will enter 100 on the line in row 17. If you're providing a 10% match, you will enter 90 into the row in line 17. And the federal share, because the federal share will be 90% of the total cost. After entering this percentage in row 17, column C should show the total federal assistance you will be requesting. This number should match the federal assistance number in your SF-424. I would like to recap some of the important budget considerations for this program. You are not required to provide a match for this program. However, NTIA will favorably consider applications that propose to contribute a non-federal cost share or a match of at least 10% of the total eligible costs for a project. Your match may be either cash or in kind. No matter what type of match you propose, you must document your capacity to provide the match in your application. If you are providing the optional match for the program, be sure to account for this in your SF-424 and the SF-424C. As I mentioned before, column A of the SF-424C will include all your costs for your project for each of the cost classifications. If you're planning on providing match, be sure to include this in column A along with your federal funding request. The Broadband Infrastructure Program does not have predefined percentages for the cost considerations. This means that NTIA does not require or have caps on how much can be budgeted for each cost consideration. This extends to the administrative and legal cost consideration. The Broadband Infrastructure Program does not have a ceiling amount or ceiling percentage on this category. Pre-application expenses are allowed under this program. However, they may not exceed $50,000. Allowable pre-application expenses include activities or expenses related to preparing an application between the publication date of the NOFO and prior to the date your award is issued by NTIA. Lobbying costs and contingency fees are not reimbursable by the program. In your application, you must clearly identify any pre-application costs in both your budget narrative and budget detail justification. Additionally, pre-application costs are incurred at the sole risk of the applicant and will not be reimbursed by NTIA if the proposed project does not receive a grant award. As I mentioned earlier, there are several non-standard forms that you must submit with your application package. The first is the project narrative. This is a 20-page, single-space document describing the key elements of your proposed project. The full requirements of the project narrative can be found beginning on page 13 of the NOFO. There are many different requirements and sections that must be addressed, so please follow the NOFO to ensure that you provide all the relevant and necessary data. The budget narrative and budget detail justification documents that I described earlier are also required with your application. Please be sure that your detailed spreadsheet can fit on letter-sized paper. If you're interested in charging indirect costs to the award, you will need to submit an indirect cost rate agreement from a cognizant federal agency. Each applicant must also submit a letter of commitment from an authorized representative from each member of the covered partnership. Additionally, maps, pro forma financial information, network diagram, systems diagram must also be submitted with your application. Now I will talk about submitting your application. The NOFO has specific requirements for the format of your non-standard application forms, such as the project narrative and budget narrative. More detail on your application format can be found on page 17 of the NOFO. You will need to submit your application through Workspace on Grants.gov. Please be sure that you have an active SAM.gov registration prior to attempting to submit your application in Grants.gov. Late or incomplete applications, as well as applications submitted by fax, email, mail, or courier service will not be accepted. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Catherine to discuss the program facts.
Thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate Natalie's willingness to help out on the broadband infrastructure team, as her knowledge of federal grants is vast. She's been a great resource for us. Now, I want to first talk about the exciting part. What happens after you turn in your application? There is a 3-step review process that NTIA will follow. First is the initial administrative and eligibility review of completed application packets. At this point, any applications submitted by anyone who is not an eligible applicant will be eliminated from further review. If there is missing or incomplete information from the applicant, we will notify them, and the applicant will have 7 calendar days to submit missing materials. If the applicant does not remedy these deficiencies in a timely manner, NTIA may deny the application. As stated in the NOFO, we will first sequence applications that address priority 1. This priority, which is proposing a covered broadband project that is designed to provide broadband service to the greatest number of households in an eligible area. These applications will then be evaluated against the objective criteria set forth in Section 5A of the NOFO to determine their further eligibility for award. To the extent that funding remains available after we complete the review of priority 1 applications, we will then review applications that address priority 2 and continue with this priority sequencing process until we have awarded all available funding. Then those applications will move to merit review, so the second box, where at least 2 objective reviewers with demonstrated expertise in broadband deployment will review and score the applications. The reviewers may be federal employees or not. During the review process, the reviewers may discuss the applications with each other, but will score the application from 0 to 100 on an individual basis. Applications scoring over 70 points will be considered qualified for funding. So after the merit review is complete, those applications that were scored as 70 or above and qualified for funding will move to programmatic review. In this review, NTIA program staff, such as myself, will use available data from the FCC as required in the Act to validate eligible service areas. The FCC Form 477 data is a data layer in NTIA's National Broadband Availability Map, NBAM, and we will rely on this data along with other data sets contained in the NBAM and any other available information to validate applicants' proposed service areas as meeting the Act's definition of an eligible service area. We will also provide a comprehensive review, ensuring that the application meets all objectives set out in the NOFO. At this point, NTIA staff may request supplemental documentation, and we will reevaluate the application package based on all of the available information presented. Applicants will have 10 calendar days to submit any additional information to NTIA. As you can see, the process is very thorough, and NTIA will be very busy this fall. Now on to the fun stuff. If you have a question, I bet NTIA website has the answer. We have been posting FAQs on our website on a fairly regular basis, trying to capture the most common questions we have received and even including some not so common ones. NTIA staff is happy to answer your questions, but I would recommend consulting our FAQs first before sending an email to us. If your question is not answered directly in the FAQs, I bet something close to it is in there and you can infer the answer. The FAQs are organized by category, including the categories listed on the slide: program overview, eligibility, other broadband funding programs, and eligible service areas, how to apply, evaluation of applications, grant award, and reporting requirements. Some common questions are listed here, and the answers can be found in the FAQs, such as what constitutes a covered partnership? Who's the lead applicant? How's the funding going to be handled? How will NTIA determine if an area is eligible? Are there any mapping requirements? Are the service areas that are to be served by non-wireline broadband services eligible for this program? Will we need to have an environmental review completed prior to submitting the application? Is minimum broadband speed based on advertised or actual speeds? If there are supply chain issues, can NTIA extend the period of performance? All of these questions and many more can be answered on the website. The easiest way to navigate the FAQs is to perform a keyword search, such as on environmental or FCC, unserved, latency, etc. Whatever you're looking for, just type in a keyword, and if the question is on there, it will pop up. If you can't find the answer, then contact Broadband USA at broadbandusa@ntia.gov. We will have another set of FAQs that will be posted very soon, and expect that we will have one more set posted a week before the application is due. So check the website regularly. And now I'll turn the webinar back over to Susanna to moderate the Q&A session for all those questions that are not found in the FAQs. Thank you for joining us today. And now I'll hand it to Susanna.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to wait for the rest of our panelists to come on screen. Thank you so much for all of the questions that you guys have been posting. There's a lot of really great questions in there. Just a heads up, if we do not address your question, it's possibly because it's already been addressed in the FAQ. So please look at that link we posted in the chat to see prior FAQs that were posted, or they are in FAQs that we're about to post and are going through legal clearance, or there actually could be questions that we don't know the answer to or need to do a little more research on, but we will include an upcoming FAQ. So please, if you don't see your question being answered, don't worry, we will address it. It's just, it may have already been addressed, so definitely look at the FAQs or it's upcoming. But I'm probably going to start with the first question that I think many folks are very curious about, and I'm going to throw this one to Catherine. Is there any possibility or estimation that the application deadline might be extended beyond 8/17/21? Oh, can't hear you, Catherine.
Oh, you're on mute.
How many times do you hear you're on mute now? I'm sorry, but the easy answer is no. There will not be. We think that this program is going to be oversubscribed, and I think that it's super important to meet the deadlines that were laid out in the legislation for us. So the quick and easy, dirty answer is no. Correct, Jennifer?
That is likely to be the case, Catherine. Yes.
Yes.
All right, so now we're getting in some nitty-gritty questions that have come up about, in particular, the Grants.gov SF424 questions. So I'm going to be asking Ming, who has joined us. He is from the NIST Grants Office and is working closely with us to administer this grant program. So I had a question here, Ming, about for the scope of work. Are you looking for the allowable cost categories and associated dollar amount from the 424C listing to be aligned with the proposed funding amount?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the short answer is yes. So whatever the amount proposed on the 424C and has to align with the scope of work, and all the costs in the 424C should be itemized and supported with detailed justification of all the cost categories in the 424C.
Great, thank you. Another question for you. In regards to the applicant section on the Grants.gov application form, for a covered partnership, should the service provider also be listed as an applicant?
The answer to that question is no. The 424C is for the lead applicants to include that information in the 424C. So the partner, I guess the broadband provider will not be a lead applicant in that form.
So I'm going to throw this to Jennifer. Where should that discussion be in terms of naming the service provider, partner, or partners that'll be part of the covered partnership?
Yeah, so you're going to want to put that in your project narrative. One of the first questions in the NOFO talks, indicates that we're looking for a description of the covered partnership, and that includes the entities that comprise the covered partnership, the state, the political subdivision of the state, along with the fixed broadband service provider or multiple broadband service providers if the covered partnership contains more than one fixed broadband service provider. So use your project narrative to explain who are the members of the covered partnership.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Ming. For the awarded grants, people are already thinking they're going to be successful. This is great. We love that confidence. Question about how the funds are going to be dispersed to the grantee. Will it be in a single lump sum upon award, or do the covered partners have to pay out of pocket and submit for reimbursement?
That's a great question. I love that anticipation. So if the application is selected for award, the award will include some specific award conditions. Unless otherwise stated as specific award conditions, the advance payment will be authorized to the nodal entity, and the pre-authorized funding will be in ASAP.gov, and the recipient will be drawing down funds from there as needed to cover the expenses incurred or anticipated incurred the maximum of 30 days. However, only the prime recipient may directly draw funds from the federal award funds, and in that connection, the prime recipient is responsible for reviewing all sub-recipient and vendor invoices to make payments to sub-recipient or vendors. I think we have the answer in the FAQ addressed directly to the question. So please check out our FAQ for that answer for more detail.
Thank you, Ming. Catherine, we have a question about the project narrative, in particular when the applicant is supposed to describe their proposed service area. the applicant wants to include photographs in a separate document and upload to a zip file. Is that allowed? Oh, you're on mute again.
It's because my house is a little loud. Sorry, guys. But I do like the easy questions, Susanna. Yes, you would. Please do, if it's available.
Yeah, definitely. There is some specific additional guidance in the NOFO
Yes.
about what they do want in the narrative, but pictures are not necessarily required. But if you want to provide them, you can upload them as an attachment.
And there
Yeah,
are
right.
instructions of the type and how to upload also on Grants.gov and in the
Right.
NOFO. So be sure and read that and the format that everything should be in. I think you said that, Susanna.
Okay, great. So I think this is for me in particular regarding how the different potential grant requirements, including the reporting requirements, et cetera, might, and the CFR rules regarding grants would flow down to the covered broadband partner, since they are not the lead applicant to the actual grant.
So it really depends on how the award is structured based on the prime recipient. If the broadband infrastructure provider is a subrecipient, all terms and conditions flow down to the subrecipient.
Great, thank you. Catherine, must the state or political subdivision be the submitter on Grants.gov, or can the vendor partner to handle the submission directly?
The state or instrumentality of the state must be the lead applicant. So yes, I could just say yes. They must, the state or instrumentality must be the applicant.
Jennifer, question for you. In regards to a proposed service area or project that has multiple sites, must a SF424C be completed for each site, or should it represent the entire project?
I think it should represent the entire project, just, because you're in the SF424C, you're just putting the cost of the total project by, object classification, as Natalie went through in depth. And, you'd want to provide one budget and then just make sure that all the service areas that are included as part of the project, the costs associated with the deployment for those service areas are included in the SF424C total cost of the project.
Okay, thank you. We've gotten a few questions about what's the difference between the project budget that needs to be submitted and highlighted in the 424 documentation and the pro forma financial information and analyses such as balance sheets, income statements, and statements of cash flow. I'm throwing that to probably both Catherine and Jennifer.
So the budget is going to be looking at the specific costs associated with the cost to deploy the broadband infrastructure. We're also evaluating certain qualifications of the applicant as they come in. So as part of the covered partnership, the state, the fixed broadband service providers. So we want to understand, so in terms of providing the pro formas, we want to understand a bit about the project itself and what kind of revenue and expense projections, but also a bit of the applicant's organizational financial capacity to take on the project, ensure that it is financially viable, sustainable. And this all factors into the evaluation criteria when we're going to be looking at the applicant's organizational capability, the reasonableness of the budget, the financial sustainability of the project. So we didn't specify particular items to be provided in the NOFO or a time frame, but I think our guidance is just, you want to provide sufficiently detailed information so a reviewer, both a merit reviewer and a programmatic reviewer, can look at that financial information and understand and be able to evaluate the application in conjunction with those evaluation criteria.
Great, thank you. Another question, Jennifer. Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Catherine, jump in.
No, I was going to say, and that question will be addressed in an FAQ that's coming out probably this week.
Yes, hopefully very soon.
Yes, yes.
So Jennifer, here's another question in particular about other federal or state support for broadband projects in the proposed service area. So the applicant wants to know, does the NOFO just require a list of federal or state support or details about the amounts being received? And they want to further know, does this apply for just the proposed service area or for the entire area the service provider operates?
So the Act asks for the applicant to disclose any federal or state support that the fixed broadband service provider is receiving in the proposed service area. And this information is, we have an obligation to make sure that we're not duplicating federal funding. So we need to make sure, we need to understand if the area is receiving federal funding from that particular fixed broadband service provider. So it would be helpful to know the speeds at which they're being, that they're authorized to deploy with the federal funding they're receiving. The amount would also be helpful, but just, in order for us to make that determination, this is the information that we need to understand.
And the timeline.
And the time, right.
Yeah.
And the time, exactly, Catherine, thank you. The timeline for when the funding is.
Yes.
All right, Ming, we're getting a lot of questions, and I think we talked about this earlier before we jumped on this webinar, but folks want to know in the Grants.gov portal where specifically they're supposed to upload attachments.
That's a great question. So actually, that question, the answer is actually in the NOFO. The instruction at the bottom of page 16, top of 17 of the NOFO section 4D address the attachment of the required documents, such as attaching project narrative, budget, and etc. The applicant actually does this via a SF424. Line 15 of this S424 is there's an add attachment button there. You click on open the zip file in order to upload the required documents per the NOFO section 4D. So you would not upload in the portal, but you upload it in the SF424 line 15. There's a button there that says attachment. You click on the button and open up a zip file, and that's where you upload all the required documents.
Great, thank you. All right, here's another tricky question in regards to other pending federal money. So Jennifer, question asked is, if we have a pending grant that we expected to receive and would fund a portion of the project, would that be entered into column B of the SF424C? So maybe this is Ming too, because I know he knows these SF424 documents like the back of his hand.
So this is other federal funding that
Correct.
an applicant might receive. So since we're not, that it would likely be in that column, because unless that it could be included as match, but since it's other federal funding, and we have an FAQ on this that talks about when, federal funding can be used as a match for another federal program. But if it could still be included as if they're using it to fund part of the cost of the project, but if it's not specifically allowable as a federal cost share, then it would go into that column B of the SF424C.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think, Catherine, I'm gonna throw this one to you. It's in regards to the review process. So the potential applicant asked, does the initial review process mean that applications will be reviewed based on the number of unserved locations that will be served in the project, and that the review process could stop there if enough applications covering large numbers of locations are received?
Okay, you lost me on there, Susanna.
So I think let me answer this. So I think they're asking that, because you talked about how
Yeah.
applications will be somewhat prioritized in programmatic review.
Yes, sequenced, right?
In sequenced, not prioritized, thank you, sequenced, based on how many unserved locations that they will be potentially serving.
Correct.
So I think the applicant wants to know, will the review process stop if there are enough applications covering large numbers of locations that are received? So I think they want to know,
And if I could just jump in, I don't think it'll stop. I mean, because basically
Right.
the initial review is just designed to make sure that the application's complete, the eligible entities are, the covered partnership is an eligible entity. We'll also take out certain data from the application and then use it to sequence. So number of households would be a factor in how we're sequencing applications. But we would put it through merit review. I don't think we wouldn't necessarily stop at that point if, if there were other applications that had more unserved households that might be sequenced beforehand, we would still continue with our merit review of the other applications.
And I did want to point out, though, to be realistic, there's $288 million in this program. That's $288 million more than we had, last November, but it's not a large amount of money.
Yeah, and so I think in some of our guidance in the NOFA, we encourage, smaller cities, counties, political subdivisions to work with their state broadband office, consult with them. So, combining an application with multiple service areas will get you in that first priority sequencing, the greatest number of households. And so we do encourage some of the smaller counties or subdivisions to consult with their state broadband office and work with them.
And there are states that are going to submit on behalf of some these projects too. So I also think it's important that you should open your lines of communication with the state anyway, because with this $288 million, there's also a lot of other broadband money out there right now that states are accessing, and states are using American Rescue Plan money for broadband projects. So talking to your state is just a really good thing to do. And if you have any questions on who to talk to on your state, that is on our website also. If you go under resources on the Broadband USA website and click on states and then find your state on the map, it'll have an email of the state contact. So I would encourage that, even if you submit on your own, to open up those lines of communication right now.
Great, thank you. Important point. All right, here's another question. I'm going to ask Jennifer this. If we are planning to serve a large number of census blocks, for example, 2,000 or so, can they be listed in an attachment? The applicant is concerned that the list of census blocks will take up an enormous amount of space in the project narrative that is page constrained.
Yes, definitely. We can submit it in an attachment. If you want to put a map, we'll also accept that as a indication of what your proposed service area is. So yeah, we would definitely allow that.
Great. All right. So right now I'm going through the questions that people, so just bear with me. I'm going to go through the questions. A bunch have popped up, but I was actually teeing up questions that many of you guys were asking during the presenter presentations. So bear with me as I go through here. I might not be going, through them super fast.
Oh, and Susanna, while you're doing that, I could just address a point that Natalie had raised in her presentation. Natalie's on vacation this week, so she's not able to join us in person, but she covered the SF424C contingency, and I just wanted to point out, and she specifically mentioned contingency fees as not being reimbursable for grant funds, and that's correct. But in line 13 of SF424C also contemplates contingency costs, which are costs associated in a construction project that may be unforeseen, and so you could build some of those costs into your estimates. We are actually going to be coming out with an FAQ in our next set that will specifically address contingency costs and where they go in line 13 and how to factor them in. We did receive a couple of questions if NTIA has a percentage amount to use for contingency costs, and we'll also say that's in our FAQ, but the general range that NTIA, as well as its sister agency, EDA, the Economic Development Association, and some of its grant programs, is a 10 to 15% of cost range to factor in for contingencies. And our FAQ will be a lot more articulate about this than I just was, but I just wanted to give people a heads up because we have gotten that question a couple of times directly submitted to us, and we will be addressing it in an FAQ that we will get out that we're hoping to get out this week.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Here's a good question. I think it's covered in the NOFO, but it's probably worthwhile bringing up again. Are there any stipulations in the NTIA grant preventing foreign supplier and contractors?
Well, we do have that prohibition, which directly relates to that act, the Secure Network Construction Act, and that's mainly for contractors, equipment suppliers that pose national security risks. And I would urge you to specifically consult those provisions for those direct prohibitions. Offhand, I'm not sure that we have, other than those prohibitions, there may not be. We do have, of course, in a Buy American preference in an executive order that we're following as part of our NOFO. I would just direct folks to look at the executive order as they're contemplating where to procure their equipment.
Okay, thank you. Ming, this is a question about Grants.gov and the 424 documentation. There was a question, will the DUNS number auto-populate the legal name section on the Form 424? What if there's a slight difference in the name of the registered DUNS number and the name entered in legal name?
That's a great question. I don't think I'm able to answer that question right now. Jennifer, do you have insight on that?
I mean, I think as Natalie was saying you want to make sure that those descriptions, like, so where you're registered in sam.gov and your grants.gov, you want to make sure that that legal and description name aligns, because I think it should populate automatically. But if there is a discrepancy, I think you want to make sure that gets rectified, so there's no problems in terms of what's in sam.gov versus what's in grants.gov.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Here's an interesting question. A broadband service provider contracted all of their construction and all of their infrastructure, and they originally bid these construction services, but they did not include standard federal clauses in that bid. Can we still use that award for the construction using these funds? Will there be any requirements to amend contracts?
Offhand, I don't think so, but I mean, we'd have to kind of look at that on a case-by-case basis and understand exactly what was being bid and some of those provisions. But offhand, I don't think that could be an issue. Ming, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, actually, I don't have any additional thing to add.
I think it would be important to put it in the narrative that this is a potential issue, that we've done this and we're this far, but this is what we didn't include. And then that can give people a chance to follow up if needed.
Yeah, I think that's the best thing, just to flag it for us, and then we can request additional information and see if there is any provisions that might be implicated by that.
I think this is coming in, or was in a recently released FAQ, but the applicant wants to know if having a named service provider as a part of the covered partnership is a requirement for the application.
It is, yeah, because the covered, a covered partnership requires state or a political subdivision and a fixed broadband service provider. So, in order to apply, you need to have both of those entities identified. You may be able to, if there are certain things on the back end in terms of procuring or things that a state or political subdivision need to do to secure the services of that fixed broadband service provider, that's okay, but we just need to understand who it is going in on the to be named in the application. So we understand that, first of all, you have a covered partnership that meets the qualifications of the NOFO. So we need to understand who is the fixed broadband service provider piece of the covered partnership. So we definitely need to know at least the name. It doesn't have to be a formal agreement yet in place. We need letters of commitment from the entities comprising the partnership, but so we would definitely at a minimum need the identity of the proposed fixed broadband service provider that's going to be part of the covered partnership.
So here's a question that kind of follows that. Does that broadband service provider or providers have to be designated as a subrecipient in the project?
It doesn't have to be. I mean, basically, you know, when we make an award, the lead applicant, which is will be the state or the political subdivision, they'll become the recipient, their prime recipient. And there's different roles that you know, they could be a contractor, they could be a subrecipient. But I think, as we pointed out in previous webinars, and it's also in FAQ, if their fixed broadband service provider is planning on like owning the network or the assets that are funded through this grant, they will need to be a subrecipient, because only recipients and subrecipients can hold title to property that's funded with grant awards. So that might, in many cases, be the determining factor as to whether the broadband service, the fixed broadband service provider component of the covered partnership becomes a subrecipient of the award.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. This is an EHP question, which I know was covered in the last webinar. So if you want to check there, but here is a specific question regarding if the environmental review needs to be undertaken site by site or as a whole service area.
I mean, we'll be, you know, it doesn't, we don't need to have everything completed beforehand. I think on our previous webinar, we covered that. It depends on the, what you're proposing to do. I think in terms of the ground disturbing activities, we want to, you know, we want to be looking at the project as a whole to determine the level of scrutiny, whether a categorical exclusion applies, whether environmental assessment applies. So we'll need to understand what you're planning, what activities are taking place at each site. But I think overall, we look at the project as a whole in determining the level of environmental review that's applied.
Okay. Ooh, back to pro forma financials. Folks want to know if the pro forma financials are specific to the lead applicant or to the service provider or to the project.
This will be answered in the upcoming FAQ. Right? And Jennifer answered it pretty eloquently, but I think that, sorry, I have a frog in my throat. I think that you need to have it for the project, but then you also need to put information in the application of the internet service provider, of the companies, to make sure that we know that they can do the project. So anything that you think that would help make sure that we know that they're financially viable and can do the project.
Right.
Yeah, and we were, like I said, I think earlier, we weren't specific. You know, we didn't have specific requirements in terms of what to propose for this, in large part because we didn't have a chance to do an information collection and under Paperwork Reduction Act. So we were trying to be as flexible as possible as to what kind of information we can request from applicants. But the idea, as you're putting together your application, is you really want to be driving everything you submit toward the evaluation criteria, because that is what merit reviewers and the programmatic reviewers are going to be looking at. So you really want to focus on that and give us the information that we need so that you have to submit a strong application that hits all those elements in the evaluation criteria, because that is what the merit reviewers are going to look at. That is what we're going to look at in programmatic review. So I would err on the side of more and more detail than lack of detail. So that's, I think, probably the best guidance we can offer at this point.
So here's a follow-up question on the census blocks. And I think I can answer this, but Jennifer and Catherine, tell me if I'm wrong. Someone asked if a map will suffice with the census blocks being served versus having a list of the census blocks. And I think we want a list of the census blocks, correct?
I think we wanted a list of the census block just because the definitions in our act are tied to census block. So I think we need to get a sense of what the census block that is being served, so we can understand what services there are already. A map will also be helpful in making that determination. And we also plan on leveraging some of the data in our National Broadband Availability Map to make some of these determinations. So, so I think we do need to have an understanding of the census blocks, but a map is also helpful in making that determination of what the proposed service area is.
Again, more is better. So a
Right.
map and the list, even if it's a long list.
And
I
I
do
think
like that
in our
idea.
fourth FAQ that we posted is deals strictly with
Yes.
some of the map information that we would really like to receive. Again, we're not being prescriptive about it because we're just indicating this is the kind of information that we would find helpful in making these determinations in terms of map, what kind of map formats and that we would like to see the data in.
I've gotten a couple questions where I think it's fantastic to see the excitement for these grant programs, but I think we just need to remind folks that there are multiple grant programs going on that NTIA is administering. One person was asking a question saying, hey, last week's webinar said the deadline was 9/1, but you guys today say that's 8/17. And I just want to reiterate, we've got we have 3 live grant programs right now. One was just launched this week, but the 9/1 due date is the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, and for the Broadband Infrastructure Program, which is the one we're talking about today, that due date is 8/17. So just wanted to make sure. And then someone kindly offered here that the discrepancy with the DUNS number and the name can be cleared up over the phone with DUNS support. So there's a hot tip right there.
Oh,
so,
great. Good
there
to
you
know.
Someone's probably had a discrepancy and learned that. So thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you.
Here's another question. This is a good question. Is it okay to put the narrative on the front and the back? So I think people are trying to maybe say one page would be like a front and back. But I think what we're trying to say, Jennifer, tell me if I'm wrong, that one page is one side, correct?
Yeah.
For the narrative.
For the narrative, yeah. So it's like it's like 20 pages,
20
single
pages,
space,
yeah. So
40 pages, double
single.
space, but
Yeah.
so one page would be one side is page 1, back side is page 2.
Yeah, and the font needs to be readable.
Right, exactly.
But
So
20 pages is a lot.
Yeah, we're having some questions about, in particular, if there is a municipal government that's providing the broadband service, that they won't be eligible. They just need to be mindful that they need to apply with a political subdivision as well. So I think we cover that in the FAQs, one of the first or
Cover
second
that
ones.
in FAQ, and the reason is because it's a partnership. The concept of a partnership requires 2 entities. So even though in theory a municipality that has its own broadband service that also acts as a broadband service provider could function in 2 roles, we'd need 2 different entities to in order to form the covered partnership. So whatever role the municipality or the municipal service provider wants to take, they can. If they want to be the political subdivision in the partnership and have another fixed broadband service provider, that's fine. If they want to take on the role of the political subdivision and then have another fixed broadband service provider, that's fine too. We just need 2 different entities that are not affiliated with each other to form the covered partnership.
So I'm getting a few more questions, so I'm going to ask because they're very specific. I think a lot of folks are recognizing that in Grants.gov, it asks for the lead applicant, but they're kind of want to make sure that they're able to correctly name their service provider. So in the table of funded participants, should the broadband provider who will ultimately own and operate the infrastructure be listed as a co-applicant or a subrecipient?
In the table of funded, they could be listed in the pre-award phase as a co-applicant because they're part of a covered partnership. So we'll look at it as 2 phases: pre-award, post-award. In pre-award, the lead applicant will be the governmental entity. The covered partnership could be designated as a co-applicant and part of the covered partnership, and all the other covered partnerships could be designated as co-applicants. And then later on in post-award, once we make an award, as I mentioned earlier, there'll be the prime recipient, which will be the governmental entity, either the state or the political subdivision. And then all the other participants will probably take on either the role of a subrecipient or contractors and vendors, or depending on what role they're taking on in actually completing the project.
Okay, thank you. All right. Going through this, guys. Going through the questions. And like I said, if we don't ask your question, it's because we most likely, hopefully, have addressed it in the FAQs or its upcoming FAQs, or there's some tricky questions that we actually need to go back and do some research. So yeah. There's a tricky one here. If an applicant is receiving CAF BLS that applies to the entire study area, which has build-out requirements across the study area, how do we determine whether the area is eligible for funding since the funds are not specific to a location? That, I don't know, Jennifer, we may not know the answer necessarily, but I'm gonna see if you know.
I mean, I think, so this is a CAF study area that they're indicating that's funding. So we'll want to know the speed, like what, because, we do have projects eligible or are considered unserved under this grant program if an area lacks access to qualifying broadband service, which, as I mentioned during the presentation, is 25 megabits per second upload, 3 megabits per second download, and sufficient latency to deliver real-time interactive applications. So that's our threshold for determining whether an area lacks is eligible for funding under this program. So I think we just need to understand where this particular area is serving what locations, and then the speed at which the service is being offered, the timing, some other considerations that we would factor into our analysis as to whether the area is eligible for funding under this program.
Okay. Here's a question about indicating unserved census blocks. The applicant is asking if they should separate the Form 477 data unserved blocks from the ones that experientially are unserved through UCLA data or other speed test data.
Well, I think I'll jump in on this. We're going to verify unserved areas. So any data that you can submit that would boost the case for it being unserved would be helpful. So if you have UCLA speed test data that says it's unserved, even though it is technically served under 477, include that, and that will be important to know.
Yep.
We look at a lot of different resources in our NBAM, National Broadband Availability Map. We look at all the sources we have, of which UCLA is one of them. But if you have that data, please submit it, and please make a note of it in your narrative.
Okay, trying to see if there's any more coming in. Oh, here's some more. Well, there's a follow-up question. How will eligible locations be verified? And I think, Jennifer and Catherine just answered that.
Yes.
Verified.
And to find out more information on the data sources that the National Broadband Availability Map has, you can go to the website, the Broadband USA website, and under resources, go to data and mapping, and it will tell you all the resources that we have. It includes federal data, it includes commercial data, and it includes state data if your state is participating.
Here's another question. I think it's in one of the upcoming FAQs. I know it was mentioned in the NOFO, but it wasn't necessarily a directive, but tell me if I'm wrong. Will grant recipients have to follow Davis-Bacon guidelines?
It's not a requirement, but it's encouraged. And then we have it as a selection factor if a project is proposing to pay prevailing wages. So it's go ahead.
It's important to read footnote 9 in the NOFO.
Yeah.
So
Davis-Bacon's only a requirement if it's in the authorizing statute. It's not in this particular statute, so we can only encourage compliance. And it is a priority of the Biden administration, so we made it a selection factor in how we'll look at applications for award.
Here's another question. I think it's in one of the recent FAQs or upcoming. What specific language do you wish to see in the letter of commitment from the political subdivisions, both as the primary applicant as well as other political subdivisions within the consortium? Is there a template?
There's not a template. We're just looking for any kind of language that basically indicates that the partners are committed to completing the project. It doesn't have to be very detailed. We're just looking for some, indication that the members of the covered partnership and any other collaborators in the project are fully committed to, if we make an award, to ensuring that the project is completed.
Okay, great.
Catherine, do you have any additional thing you think?
No, I mean, if it's a group of local governments who are coming together to do it, I mean, a resolution, anything that proves that the commitment's there. So particularly if you're coordinating with other government entities, I think a resolution would be the best way of doing it, or a letter. I mean, letters of support work, but to have it official and public, I think is important. That's coming from a local government background.
Right. And just to follow up, that another question in that same vein, should the commitment letters summarize what is addressed in the covered partnership agreement in terms of construction, ownership, and reporting responsibilities?
Yes, that would be helpful for us to know. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm still looking at the questions. I think we're about winding down here. They're not coming in fast and furious like they were earlier. Again, I just want to reiterate that there are a lot of FAQs that have been posted, more coming this week, and that there will be a copy of the slides, a transcript, and the video that will be posted to the Broadband USA website, specifically under the grant programs tab and broadband infrastructure. So definitely go and look there for more information as needed. And, if you, continue to have questions, send them to us. We are trying to address all of them as much as possible. And we know that the timeline is getting really tight right now. But thank you again for attending. Any last comments, Jennifer, Catherine, Ming?
No.
Exciting times, exciting times.
Yes.
Yeah, just one thing to add that, don't wait until the last minute to submit the applications. I think I mentioned in every webinar, because sometimes Grants.gov goes to maintenance. So you want to make sure that you're submitting those applications on time. So you look forward to that.
I think it is going down. I saw it, but it's after our window closes. I think it's going to be doing some production work on August 23rd and 24th. So you guys,
it's good timing on our part.
It's good timing on our part. So.
Oh, and also wanted to mention, I have heard that Grants.gov has some great training videos and help desk and resources there too. So if you have specific questions about the forms or the tool or the application, well, the application of Grants.gov, not our application per se, definitely look there too. That could be a resource for y'all. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, they're a great help desk. It's open 24/7, and they've already helped a number of applicants that we're aware of, and they're standing by to help others as questions rise.
All right, well, thank you again, everyone, for spending this afternoon with us. Just heads up, tomorrow's webinar will be on the same topic. So if you want to listen again, please sign up for tomorrow's webinar, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.